So this is the last workshop in this series on qualitative. Can you grab the door thingy? And so again, just a recap, that that is not fall. I did never fix that. So good that I'm consistently inconsistent. So we talked about data cleaning. We talked about data preparation, qualitative coding, and then today we're talking about qualitative analyses. The previous ones are already on my website, or should be. If they're not, please let me know. And then to do this one we put up today after I edit and maybe fix something before I do it. So I wanted to put up, we talked about a lot in the last section. We talked a lot about coding. And so I was looking through my slides, and before we move on to, yeah. The Zoom? Can you? Send them to me, Ting, and somebody needs to forward them the email, the calendar invite. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So in here, as I was looking over this qualitative coding, I think there's still a lot of things that are still relevant for analyses, especially like starting in small chunks, and having a clear plan and communication, making sure everyone's kind of on the same page, are all still really important. Again, we have this beast for the general strategies for preparing qualitative data. Again, we talked about this last time. My pointer's not going to show up on this thing. An overview of coding. Again, I go over all of this. We talked about a lot in the last session. But then also kind of preparing for data analysis. So before we even begin the analysis, we're going to start to identify patterns, filter and kind of maybe sort, be alert for unexpected things. We're going to be making notes, analytic memos after analytic memos. That's why we're calling them analytic memos instead of just memos. And then again, we're interpreting the data, and the big takeaway here is, with my ADHD, I always talk about shiny objects and squirrels. And so there's so much going on. Remember to focus on your research questions and what you're trying to answer. Make those notes for later. Let future Nikki, future all of you deal with the new and exciting things. But remember, always circle back to your research questions. So today we're going to talk about qualitative methodology. And I'm going to preface this by saying that I am not a qualitative methodologist. Some of you are just going to feel betrayed. I'm not a qualitative methodologist. I do a lot of qualitative work. I recently read an article, which I'm going to share with you, that talked about how qualitative methods are really popular in grad school, but then it's a topic that's under taught just for lack of resources and things like that, which I think is true here too. That, we're still missing the kind of more advanced classes. And my program was like that. So I had one class. I've been reading and putting together and attending sessions and making notes and just kind of developing this kind of, I'm not going to say self-taught, but definitely didn't have as much like formal instruction. So if you're interested in qualitative methodology, I really suggest, you take the course we have here, which is really, really good, but a starting point. Because as you do more in qualitative methodology, just like in statistics, like in quantitative, you'll learn about everything. But as soon as you're like, multi-level modeling is my jam, you might take a class on just that. We don't really have that as much in qualitative. So, reading as much as you can and finding out more is really important. So keep that in mind. Please do not go to a qualitative expert and say, well, Nikki said, because they're just going to laugh at you. They're going to be like, who? That person? So today I'm going to talk about, I am going to give you an overview and then apply it to the specific project that we've been talking about all semester. And then as we go, answer questions about yours specifically if you have them. Maybe. So the first thing I want to talk about is, I'm going to separate these out because a lot of people put in methods and they just kind of talk about everything and jumbled up and garbage. So we want to use the right language. So I'm gonna call this first research design, which are the overarching strategies for answering research questions. Then I'm going to talk about analytical approaches, which are the perspectives that we use to analyze the data. And then the actual analytic methods, which are the processes that we use to analyze the data. I'm going to go over these. These are not comprehensive. They're as comprehensive as I could make them, but they depict common methods. Every time I've added one, I was like, oh, there's a new one, and there's a new one. So I've listed several resources, many of which are available through McGill's library that I think are, again, for you to explore. So the different types of qualitative methodologies. So this should be a review if you've taken the qualitative class. You have case studies, which are intensive study of specific instances, an ethnography, where you describe, analyze, and interpret cultures, a phenomenological study, which is just a bear to spell and say, but it is to understand the structure of lived experiences. A grounded theory study is to develop theory to explain phenomenon. And then a native inquiry, which investigates stories of events. Some people I've seen have a sixth one called content analysis, but I'm including it elsewhere. So some of these, I think you might have heard of all of these, you might be more familiar, but I would say that most of the qualitative research that you've read in educational psychology aren't actually labeling the one that they're using, myself included, because I struggle sometimes to find the box that mine fits in. You'll also see more of these in certain fields than others. So let's talk about analytic approaches. So one of your approach to analyzing your data could be interpretational, where you try to describe and explain the phenomena. Sometimes it can be structural, where you're trying to understand the structure of the data collected, how many times something happened, or the sequence of who talked. It's much more kind of, I'm not going to say superficial, but it's just you're looking at a different thing when you're looking at this data. Reflective, so you're using your intuition and judgment to portray or evaluate a phenomenon. Comparative, comparing different units to study the phenomenon. Cultural, studying how cultural groups think about phenomena. And it sounds like phenomena. Critical is to understand phenomena with a political, social, and organizational context. And so this one is the critical, you've heard of critical race theory, et cetera. But it studies more like power and dynamics between like race and gender, ethnicity, et cetera, class. So you can see how some of them, like a case study, often uses a comparative approach. You have two different cases, maybe male and female, which is sex, not gender, let's be clear. And you want to compare how some phenomenon, motivation in STEM is different. Okay, so some of them kind of go hand in hand. You can also use more than one, right? So you might use a comparative approach. You're comparing two groups, but what are you comparing? Are you comparing like using an interpretational, like you're trying to interpret what they're saying? Or is it that in their conversation, girls use the word can or want to or whatever it is more than the boys? So you can definitely combine these, but this is really important to think about before you do it, because you're like, what is your goal here? What are you trying to do? And again, one of the biggest frustrations in my life is when people are like, I'm just going to go in and see what I see and do what I do. Like, no, you really need a plan of like, what are you looking for? The other thing that's really interesting too is thinking about how we define culture, right? How we choose the context for the critical ones. And so being very explicit and very clear about what we mean by that and how we're going to do it. And so then there's analytical methods. So the big one, thematic analysis. I think 9 times out of 10, when I read a educational psychology qualitative, it's like, we did a thematic analysis as the whole method, which is problematic. But the thematic analysis is to identify patterns of meaning, also known as themes. It is not dissimilar from a content analysis, which is more about evaluating patterns within the content. I know it's a stretch to put that one together. This is, again, it's about the level of interpretation, right? So a content analysis could be like, this text has 50 pages and this text has 25, or this text, and the topic of this essay is blah, and the topic of this essay is B. It has much less interpretation than a thematic analysis, which you'll go in there and code and interpret, etc. Then there's a narrative analysis, which hopefully you can see which one that goes with, where you're analyzing stories for meaning. Then there's a discourse analysis, where you analyze language within context. Again, I can take transcripts and I can apply a thematic analysis to them, or I can look at specific language patterns, like how the words that they're using, the way that they're saying things, and it gets at a discourse analysis. I mean, a lot of these are very similar, but structurally also different. And then, of course, the grounded analysis, which is constantly comparing emergent data to detect patterns. And then the phenomenological analysis is where you're trying to produce and connect rich description of experiences. A lot of information. I got through that a lot quicker than I thought. So questions, I know there's tons. Go ahead.
We've talked a lot about this kind of stuff in the fall class, and one of the things that still escapes me a little bit is how we have these overarching like research designs of like narrative inquiry, and then you have this specific narrative analysis. Like, I don't really know how can you have like a narrative design but then have like a discourse analysis?
So the question is kind of matching designs to analyses. And so this is something I struggle with, and I'm going to give you some examples of my data, of like different ways we could look at our data and interpret it. So the way I think about this is gonna, oh yeah, this thing. The way I think about the methodologies is, this is from the beginning. This informs your data collection. This informs your coding scheme. Like, this informs kind of everything. And so from here, based on the data that you collected, if you were doing a narrative inquiry, which is about stories of events, more than likely, yeah, you'll probably end up with a narrative analysis. But the thing is, and you'll see in my examples, it doesn't have to, you don't have to just do one though, right? So you might start with a narrative analysis where you analyze stories for meaning, and then you realize that you also have this kind of phenomenological thing happening. Usually the difference though, I mean, all qualitative data samples are relatively small, but narrative analysis is like sometimes 1 or 2, whereas phenomenological is still a lot to kind of make connections between different people and those kind of things. So that's where, like I said, it goes back to data collection. And so if you decided to do a very large narrative inquiry, you could technically do other things. So that's one of the big, again, my understanding of it. How many disclaimers can I put in this?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Why, this is probably a dumb question, why would it be problematic to only do thematic analysis?
It's not problematic. So the question was, why is it problematic to only do a thematic analysis? And so it isn't. And so if I hinted
Like
at that.
setting aside, you're like, some people just do this, which would be problematic.
I don't think it's problematic. I think it's one of those, the way I think about it is that my philosophies, my, epistemologies, who I am as a person, my experiences are going to shape the questions I ask. And a lot of times those questions end up being similar in structure and require similar analyses. I think as a field, educational psychology, you're going to see more of some of these than others, just because, again, the norms of the fields, or journals, or those kind of things. So I think this is what I struggle with as I got up here and I said, I'm going to do a workshop on qualitative analyses. And I was like, I really only do one. I've done other ones. But like discourse analysis, you'll see really more popular in those that do like natural language processing and who study language. And I study interactions and communication, but not like in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying I couldn't, but
does Christine Bay do discourse analysis, or does she just study discourse using a different method?
I would ask her.
Yeah.
And I think that's the tricky part, is that if I go and I read a lot of authors, everyone throws the thematic analysis in there. And then I'll show you, there's a new article from Braun and Clark that one of my students shared with me, that Braun and Clark are like the people who you cite for thematic analysis. And what happens is people say, oh, the thematic analysis, they throw their citation on there. And in their latest paper, which I have referenced in here, they're basically like, don't cite us without reading us. Like y'all are, and they even like called out someone. It was amazing. It's like, oh, they're just going full-fledged. Where they talked more about a reflexive thematic analysis. I will say it is one of the hardest things I've ever read. Maybe ease into it. But it is phenomenal. Like if you are going to do a thematic analysis, and you're just going to throw a citation on there, maybe, check it out. But I don't think, so that's the way I think of analysis. I think what concerns me though, is the people that don't have a plan, that are just like, I'm gonna go in there and find a couple things and see what's in common. And they're like, I've got some themes. I did a thematic analysis. It's kind of I think it's become, this is just my opinion, I think it's become this kind of like crutch / catch-all that people like to label. And then because our reviewers don't know enough to put it through the ringer. So that's kind of some of the stuff I'm seeing. And so I don't think there's a problem with doing it, thematic analysis. It needs to be done well and documented clearly. But it does help from the beginning if, you have a plan of how you're going to collect the data and what exactly you're going to be looking at. And then what approaches is kind of like how you're going to be looking at them. Right. Mm-hmm. Good.
I feel I get it and I don't at the same time. I'm just wondering if you can give some concrete examples to help me understand, especially like those content answers, and also can you go to the next? Yeah, thematic content, and also the grounded analysis, because they're all looking for patterns.
Yeah, and so the question is like, these starting to all kind of look the same, and they've got this underlying thing in common, right? Of like compiling the data and making sense and looking for patterns, etc. And so I think thematic analysis, it's not really, I've never seen it read this way, but I think of it as kind of like, that you're looking for themes kind of more in general, and these other ones I think are a bit more specific, right? So a content analysis is really more about the structure of the content. So I look at like a newspaper for September 11th from New York, and a newspaper from, I guess it would be September 12th in LA, and then I look at like different words that they use, right? I'm not going to go in and code and do like different themes and things like that. It's more of a structural, like I'm analyzing the content, not the underlying meanings of the content. Similar thing for discourse, except for I'm applying it to language. At least that's how I perceive it. And a narrative analysis, again, it's that like you interview a narrative. I've done a couple narrative inquiries of you just like have someone, you tell their story, you know, what was it like being on, I don't know why this took a dark turn, but 9/11, we'll stick with that. Is that you know, when you have them, you tell their story and you really are about documenting their story. And so this is the one that like, there are some fields that are more qualitative friendly. And so you'll see narrative analysis in some fields more so than others, because it's not general, well, no qualitative or generalizable, but all the people that hate on small sample size especially hate on these. But it isn't, the goal is to tell someone's story and to understand their lived, you know, kind of experience of, and again, this might be, I might do a narrative analysis for like, you know, the president, right? Like to understand like one specific story, or it might be, you know, a more meaningful person that I'm asked, maybe. Whereas phenomenological is something similar, but you're going to have more, and you're really focusing on these descriptions of experiences. So you're looking for patterns, but are related to experiences, not like, well, what did they mean when they described that? But it's focused on understanding the exact experiences and how they related to the specific culture and context, et cetera. And then the grounded analysis is, you know, is something that, and I'll give another example. I could be so wrong here, I'm trying my best. It's that kind of building up of like, you know, it could be inductive coding, it's probably going to be inductive coding, and you start to see things emerge. Because this one is so inductive, I think it could be related to language, it could be related to this, it could be related to multiple things. And you might develop a theory related to different things. That's the hardest one to describe because it's so like loose. Let me see what I got. All right, one question online. In your experience, which of these methods are more likely to be used together than others? Again, I think that there's across the three different types, you know, a case study is going to obviously align with, sorry, I skipped one. A case study is going to align with maybe comparative methods, right? And then probably something else. And then depending on what you're comparing, it could be, again, what they say, how they say, what they mean, what their experiences are, etc. You know, but have I ever seen a case study that uses a phenomenological analysis? Not really. I usually see phenomenologies. They're trying to understand it. They're not really trying to make those differences between groups, but you could. Again, depends on your research question. And I am going to give you some examples of how different things kind of go together. Any other?
I was just thinking about grounded theory, and my understanding is that you can use a grounded theory method to sort of come up with a theory to explain what you see across your cases or whatever your unit of study is, and then try to work with that theory and see if it can apply across other contexts.
Yeah, so grounded theory is like, I use it. It's one of the biggest thorns in my side because it does, I think a lot of people interpret it as like, I have free reign and I can do whatever I want. And they're like, oh, I don't have a theory, I'm developing a theory. No, I've got some quotes on another page. Like grounded theory is not, inductive is never completely devoid of theory. Like you still go in there and you look for certain things. I really like this term that I heard when I was in grad school, like big T theory and little t. So this is going to give you a little t theory. And so to me, how do I use qualitative work is usually to understand something that I can eventually do quantitative. So this theory is That's why we call it a theory and not a fact, right? And so, yes, to be tested in later, and again, you can get into mixed methods and all that kind of stuff, but it's about understanding and developing, like understand, especially when you're doing like new phenomena or underexplored, or how do these things work together? So in here, you might also look at it from like a comparative lens, right? Or interpretive lens. And again, there's theories that are like, okay, and then there's, ooh, that's interesting. But it's still, to get to that big T theory status would definitely need follow-up, yeah. All right, we'll come back for more questions. So let's look at examples from the press data. For those of you that couldn't attend or didn't attend and haven't watched the videos, there are slides in here from there to give you some background. For now, I'm going to just assume that you all remember it and you're all like super excited about it. But we created scenarios and we sent them out to people online through Prolific and had them say, like, how would you respond to this situation? And our goal is to really understand differences in how people respond to situations, like the people that avoid confrontation, the people that go right at it, the people that outsource, etc. So that's our goal, and we have that data, and I showed you at one of the previous ones some like fake version of those data. But I'm going to go through the different options now to show you how you can analyze these data depending on what your research questions were. So I'd already told you mine, but you have this data, and whether you do it as a secondary data analysis or whether or not you actually had this question when you collected the data. So option one, what if I asked, how do responses differ between undergrad and grad students? So they had to be students in order to participate, but it could be, and it even goes more than this, of grad students, undergrad, meta-professional anyway, but let's just say so of my methodologies, which ones do you think this is?
Comparative?
Not yet, you're, go up a level. So that's my approach. So of the methodologies, phenomenology, narrative inquiry, the case study, I'm looking at specific cases. And this was a very common one. I use it a lot. This is one of my go-tos. It's a case study. And in that, I'm going to be using a, shout out to whoever, yep, I was online. I can't see you. Comparative, but also a structural. Okay. So to answer this question, I want to compare, but here, one way that I can look at it is to really just kind of look at like, what are the differences in word length? My undergrad, I think we required them to put 15 words. Yeah. But I want to see how long the words are. How long did undergrads, how many words did they write versus the grad students? Or maybe the sequence of codes. I want to see that, in there, they usually talked about like, this is what I would do, but sometimes they talked about like, oh, this has happened to me before, or so I want to compare like the sequence of their responses, like the different patterns in their responses to between the two groups. So I'm going to look at it from a structural. I'm just making stuff up here just to show examples. I would not do that, but and so then what would I do since I'm using a structural approach, what kind of analysis do you think I'll be running?
So I want to say content, but content and discourse kind of.
Content. Discourse, and this is, again, shows my lack of understanding of that space and why I don't do those things. Discourse, I think, is more for talking, but again, because this is more of like a content, where it gets tricky is like, if I have a transcript, it's like,
Sure. Yeah.
and again, I think it's splitting hairs, but I think too, with the discourse, you could also include like nonverbal communication and things like that.
Okay,
Again,
okay.
this isn't, I know, so, but this is an example, yes, of a content analysis if I really want to, because I care for some reason, if undergrads write more words than grad students, I could do this analysis. Good. And so this also shows you that, like, one of the, I don't know if I'd call it a problem or just like the reason people hate on qualitative is like, I could have asked any question with this data. Not any, but a bunch. Whereas I feel like when you collect data, and you can also do secondary data with quantitative, but I feel like you collected data in a particular way, asking particular questions, it's less open to interpretation and to do other new things with it, less so maybe. And that's why people are like, oh, let me just see data. And so the haters, you got to get out in front of them.
Doesn't prevent people from doing.
Oh, yeah,
that
right.
stuff.
Oh, well, yeah, people,
Leave it
yeah.
alone.
Especially, when people are desperate for data, I kind of get it. But option 2, how do students from different countries, so again, prolific, did from all over the world, how do students from different countries respond to these challenging situations? So again, we asked them, I think the example I gave was like, your project's due at the end of next week. All of a sudden, someone has a medical emergency. What would you do? And so I'm going to analyze those, how they're responding to that from different countries. So do students in Asia respond this way compared to students in Europe, or et cetera? I know that those are continents and not countries. Please be like, oh, okay. Thoughts on this one, the methodology? Yeah.
See, I'm tempted to say ethnography because you're looking at culture, but I still think it's case study because of it.
Oh, so which is funny because I thought I put case study, so that's interesting. So I think it depends on how you frame, right? So a case study would mean that I'm going to make, in my data collection, I'm probably going to make sure that I have a certain amount from each of the countries that I'm concerned about. Whereas here, I didn't do that. So I'm going to look more at maybe an ethnographic and focus on the culture. So I'm not really comparing them necessarily. I'm not going to say this, when I divide up my data, I'm not going to say, okay, this one and code them separately than this one. It's more about when I'm analyzing trends, I look for, I bring in that culture and make sure that I don't lose track of that as I'm putting these themes together and noticing these patterns. So what some of my themes might be related, to that. Yeah.
Is it possible to do something like an ethnographic study? I keep hearing everybody saying like that they want to be there for like 10 years.
Yeah. Okay. Again, the reason I thought it was case study is like, I didn't think I was brazen enough to put ethnographic study on there. This is not the kind of work, I don't do this a lot. So I'm trying to squeeze it in there. Again, if you submitted it to a journal, the Journal of Ethnographic Studies, you ain't getting accepted. That's where you have to really kind of understand the field. This is not going to be a popular opinion for all of those people who are not watching this. This one's a tricky one for sure. I think.
I see your point about the culture.
And again, so they would say, again, there's good data and there's better data and there's worse data, right? So is this the data I should have collected to answer this question? Nah, no. But it's the data I have, and technically I could answer this. Would it be an exceptionally strong study? Probably not. So those are kind of also things to consider.
Could you do something like phenomenology?
So phenomenology is about the lived experiences. So my question and also too, this is a very weak ethnographic study. One of my students is doing a specifically very similar study to this and asking about how their culture impacts it. That would definitely be more of an ethnographic study. This is a stretch. But a phenomenology really is more about lived experiences. So I would have said, like, what's the worst thing that's ever happened to you in group work? And how did you, So it's framing, yeah.
So like it could sort of work like that depending on what.
And again, this first part should drive the data you collect, right? So that's why it was kind of hard of like trying to force things in there. So here I look at a cultural lens. I'm still using a comparative, so I'm not necessarily doing a case study, and that I'm dividing them into specific cases. So in a case study in the beginning, you should really say like, I'm going to look at, in the work I've done with case studies, I'm going to work at low, medium, and high self-rated groups. Here, a case study is I'm going to do Asia, Europe, North America, South America, and go from there. We're here, and I'm not drawing those lines. I'm still doing some comparative stuff, but I'm more focused on the culture. Mm-hmm. And then I'm gonna do I'm sorry, maybe I like to guess. And then I'll do a thematic analysis I'm trying to understand the meaning and connect to. I mean, I could have done a content analysis and just focused on the words and the way that they described it, but I want to do it to answer my question. I want to do more of a thematic analysis and you know, are they confronting? Are they doing this? Those kind of things. This is, again, one of many examples.
Why would you do a narrative if they're talking about the situation? Like, could it not, is it possible to mix them? Like a narrative thematic kind of thing?
I mean,
Sorry,
I'm thinking like, the question is, can you mix a narrative and thematic? You can mix certain things. And I think back to the question online is some things kind of go together. Some things are harder to picture. I don't like to say no, but I can't think of an example. How about that? So can you? Maybe. Would I advise it? Probably not.
I always think it's so hard for me to understand like that narrative thing. Like, anything can really be a story if you're like answer, right?
And usually a narrative is much more in depth. Like it is more like you're sitting on the front porch hearing, like you really are hearing their whole story. You're not just asking them an interview and saying like, what did you do that one time?
Okay.
It's really about like, walk me through I mean, it's more storytelling and you're breaking it apart. And so the point is to understand this lived experience, rather than like pulling out separate pieces and like that. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
And it's hard to do with thematic, or again, look for patterns because your sample size is usually very small.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So what kinds of strategies do students use? So this is closer to the actual question that we have. So we're trying to figure out what they use. I'm kind of ignoring context for now. I just want to see, here are all the responses to each of the, 59 different scenarios. So within the 59 scenarios, there was 20, I think, responses. And I'm looking for like, what are the strategies look like for this response? And what are the strategies look like for this response? And then eventually I'm going to look at like, there's categories of situations. How do they kind of look, what are some patterns between them in different types of situations? What do you think this one's going to be? And again, this is just one example. Oh, so the first one was case study. There's 5. Case study, narrative inquiry, grounded theory, phenomenology, and ethnography. Did I do them all? Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Narrative.
So let's go through it. I'm hearing a lot of things. Phenomenology is again about their experiences. I could, again, I need better questions. I tried to make one for all of them and I was like, that ain't happening with this data. It really would be more of like, I watched them in groups and I coded what they actually did and I talked to them about their lived experiences and why they did. And that's just too much for what I'm trying to do. So Could you? Sure. But I wouldn't. What else? Maybe case study. I could, if I wanted to compare like the strategies that students use for, I think it was like task, non-task, you know, specifically using a case study. It's a possibility. I mean, again, I left the research questions purposely vague. Please do not do that. So for this one, because this really hasn't been researched all that much, except by me, and it was a very different context, I'm going to use grounded theory. I don't know what these strategies are, and I don't know where I'm going exactly. I've got the theory. I know that the theories, when they talk about strategy use, I'm going to connect it to self-regulated learning and social regulation of learning. And I know I'm like, what are they targeting and those kind of things. But as for the actual strategies, I don't know exactly what I'm going to be looking at. But I'm going to use an interpretational. So this one's actually a 2-lever analysis. Gotcha. So the first thing I'm going to do is interpret, like, what are they saying? Because somebody will be like, I would tell the teacher and have the teacher tell them that they have to show up and do all this kind of stuff. And then someone else might say, email the professor, right? I'm still interpreting them of like, what exactly are they talking about? That's an easy one. You know, and sorting into codes. And so this is that kind of that grounded theory of what exactly is this saying? Okay, is this similar to the one I've already said, and kind of building that kind of recursive of like, oh, they said this, and keep moving. The reflexive piece comes in once I've got the strategies for those underlying structures of like avoidance. Like these strategies all seem to be like avoiding confrontation, and these strategies are more like confrontation. I'm oversimplifying this way too much. And so then I would use a grounded analysis for the first part, and then I would do more of a thematic analysis, looking at the meaning underneath. And again, using this reflexive piece, which some people hate on, but using my experiences and my understanding of all these to, you know, because they might have nowhere in there did they talk about avoiding confrontation, but that's what they're doing, right? Like I'm adding my own expertise to that and making that conclusion. And then some people say, well, who are you to do that? Well, I'm a human. That's my favorite part, is like, who are you to study like emotions? I was like, well, I have a lot of them, so.
Who are literally any of us.
Right. So then real quick, I wanted to end, I mean, I'm going to go back to some questions, but I wanted to end on a couple of notes on the thematic analysis, because it is like the go-to for so many people. And this is from the new Braun and Clark, which you can't see because my little thing is, oh, sorry, it's hiding. So these are some quotes and some summarizations from this paper that it's really heavy, but I really liked it. So that thematic analysis is not about following procedures, but rather understanding what the procedures facilitate, what they give access to, and that these are tools for a process, not the purpose of analysis. So when people ask me, and some of you came in here thinking like, she's going to teach us how to do a thematic analysis. And I'm like, step one. There is no step one. Step two. So it's really about more of understanding what these procedures, what is the themes, what do the themes allow you to do and give you access to. This is one of my favorite. I will use it for the rest of my life. You cannot enter a theoretical vacuum when doing thematic analysis, even when doing inductive. Paradigmatic, epistemological, and ontological assumptions inescapably inform analysis. We're humans. I love this. Themes do not emerge. Don't read any of my papers in the past.
Or like, the majority of the papers.
Yeah,
in
and
qualitative theory.
yeah, and so they said this. I must have missed something in 2006, but I'm getting it now. That, and I've definitely cited them before. Themes do not emerge. Researchers play an active role in identifying patterns and themes, selecting which are of interest, and reporting them to the readers. They didn't just pop out and hit you in the face, right? And so having that kind of reflection, and so the name of this article, because you can't see it at the bottom, is about a reflexive thematic analysis. And so again, it's heavy, but good. One more? I think I've got one more.
That 2006 paper is an 80-page paper?
No, it's like a journal article, so it's like,
it's
yeah.
okay.
And then again, I'm picking and choosing what I mean, it's a whole thing. But be a thoughtful researcher. Do not just obediently follow what methodology writers say, or people who kind of pretend like they know me. That Braun and Clark provide a compass and a map to navigate your adventure and to encourage researchers to reflect on what is best suited to their philosophical commitments and the analytic purpose of their research. I feel like that was a good place to end. That doesn't mean you can just go in and do whatever you want, but good sentiment. So in reflection, I just wanted to say the analyses that we use really varies by field, personal philosophies, and the constructs of interest. There are certain constructs that are going to be harder to measure, to understand in different qualitative analyses and data collection. So these are all kind of things to think about. And so then I thought we would take a few minutes. I will answer more questions, but also 10 minutes plus a little extra. Are there any analyses that you are more interested in or more inclined to use? Is a nice reflection. We can answer that question, or we can answer or ask other questions. I see some in the chat. Oh. There's a question online that says, what if my research questions drives to a different analysis? So I conduct a few in one study. I definitely think a few in one study is possible. Again, depending on your research question and the depth of it. I want to be clear about saying like, just head in a new direction. More than likely, if your research question drives to a different analysis, you probably had like my research questions that just weren't specific enough in what exactly you were looking for, if I had to guess. But you do want to have a plan and try to stick to it if possible, if for no other reason than like this is one of the biggest criticisms of qualitative research is that we just do whatever we want. So if you do pivot, I think there needs to be clear justifications, clear reasons. And again, I would say that's why that research question, like the fact that you couldn't tell from my research question, I did on purpose. You should be able to tell from the research question, like which direction are we going in? Yeah.
I keep finding myself trying to sort of map these three things, research design, analytical approach, method, onto how quant studies are built. Just to like sort of think in my head, like, okay, this is where we sort of decide that we're doing this analysis. This is how we decide we're collecting this data in this way. Do you think that's like, do you think these are like comparable? And if so, like, how do you think, like research design, analytical approach, the methods, do you think, like, how would you explain how these compare to the quant stuff that we do? Just to like sort of try and help me wrap my head around these different steps, if it's possible.
So the question is, how does this compare to like a quantitative research design? Like, how do they connect to,
The process of
Yeah.
building it, sort of? Does it compare? Does it make sense to compare?
Can you compare? Sure. Does it make sense to? I don't know. I mean, again, for example, I'm trying to think of like, okay, multi-level modeling or one-way ANOVA, where that would be in this kind of in the. I don't know. I definitely can't. I'm going to stop right there. I cannot make that connection. I think the big thing that they both have is the importance of planning and design, right? So how many times have we started a method section with the participant? We had 15 participants and that kind of stuff. Start with a research design, lay that groundwork. Like this is what we're doing, especially if you have something more complex. Give the readers a heads up that you're going to be doing something, or what you're doing, so that they know that when they read 5 participants, they're not like 5. You're like, oh, I'm doing a narrative inquiry. 5 makes sense. We skip over that research, or sometimes it's in the purpose a little bit. And of course, there's no there is a formula, but it's a loose, this is how an empirical article should look, but it's not 100% set in stone, and there's some different places.
That it's going to be, it's not like standard practice to talk through these kinds of things in Qual. Like it seems like you're distilling things that just make sense for good research.
Yeah, so the comment was that this isn't common, and this is, yes, this was my grounded theory approach. I know. When I was organizing it, and I was Google, and so again, some of these citations at the bottom, one of which is has an art. I mean, it's just like an encyclopedia almost of what is critical analysis, and you click it and you read just a short article on it. As I was going through that book and looking at all the different things, they just felt different to me. And so I was using my very old textbook from my PhD, and it talked about an interpretational analysis in the same vein as something like a content analysis. I was like, these aren't really looking at the same thing. So that structure is very much something I came up with, for better or worse. So the terms you might not find, I'm not gonna say I came up with, I organized it into themes, if you will, based on my own understandings. But I think that's what you'll see, and this is not a knock on anything or anyone. We all do things a little differently, but the way my thinking, my philosophy, and all those kind of things go is I need that system and that structure. Whereas I know you've read plenty of things without it. Do you actually need it? If I didn't include all this information, it'll probably be fine. But for me, it's really important that I know where I'm going from the beginning so I don't get sidetracked. And so I think, again, that's where it's not a norm. Maybe it should be. That's an argument for another day. But that kind of just shows the way I think about things. I mean, this shouldn't surprise you if you remember this thing, right? I'm a very sequential, and so again, thematic analysis is my jam. Grounded theory is my jam of just making sense and patterns and inductive and deductive and all that kind of stuff. But as I was preparing this, that helped me, breaking it down into these 3 different types, which again, these are not comprehensive lists. This helped me to kind of think about what I would do for analysis. Now, again, some of you came to watch me do analyses, and they're way too long and painful and to do that. But I think to understand what approach you're even going to use and the different questions that you can ask. And again, I don't ask a lot of content-based questions, but I could, depending on my context. It also could be that part of my analysis is looking at more text-based things and others are conversations, and I put them together. That's a perfect example where you could have different analyses in the same study because you're analyzing different types of data and then moving towards like a common understanding. Any other questions? So I will stop. No, not my video. I will stop recording.